Hi, my name's Claire Wingfield and I work as an editor and literary consultant here in Scotland. Today I'm going to be talking to the Swiss-born novelist and short story writer Regi Claire. Regi's books include The Waiting, Fighting It, The Beauty Room and Inside Outside. Her work has twice been shortlisted for a Saltire Scottish Book of the Year award and has been featured in Best British Short Stories. Regi is a fantastic writer of meticulous prose, so I wanted to take the chance to dig deep into her writing process. Something writers are often asked is what comes first when you have an idea for a new project. Is it character, theme, or perhaps the location?
Hi Claire, and hello everyone. It really depends what gets me started. It can be a phrase. I might be brushing my teeth, or walking the dog, and suddenly a few words pop into my mind. Like one of the stories I have been doing recently started like this, like the phrase, Topaz dance-stepped into the room. I think that's what I heard, and I had no idea who Topaz was, but I liked the name, I liked the words, I liked the rhythm, and that's how it got started. And the story has been published since and so on. Another time I might be very much influenced by a location. In fact, my most recent novel, The Waiting, was very much, or is very much, based on the city of Edinburgh. In fact, the centre stage is a park in Edinburgh, the main park, the Meadows. Then I might have characters that interest me. For example, my mother in Switzerland, and you've probably heard I have an accent and English is not my native tongue. I'm Swiss German, I speak Swiss German. Anyway, my mother in Switzerland would often send me clippings from newspapers and maybe put a little annotation saying, oh, you might be interested in this, it's a good story, might make another story one day. And in fact, this one particular piece I wrote, a very long story that was inspired by this woman who is a murderer. I suppose she's still alive. She's in prison in Switzerland because she couldn't stop killing women. And I was just so shocked by the fact that a woman, and she actually asked the judge never to let her go because she knew, or she knows, she cannot not kill.
Is that a story we can read? Have you had that one?
Yes, in fact, that's the title story of Fighting It, of my most recent short story collection. I imagined her in this wire cage, as I call. She's in fact, I think the story starts, she's in the wire cage again, and she's actually is a treadmill, but she's segregated from the rest of the prison population in this exercise yard, and she's like a hamster on a wheel, and it's like the symbol for the whole story. So it really depends. I'm open to any.
So it's very different for each project.
Yes, absolutely.
And I was going to ask you about Edinburgh, actually. I think you began to talk about how Edinburgh has influenced you. But having lived in Edinburgh for so long, is it 20 years?
Yes, it's 20 plus, actually.
Do you feel there's a great influence on your writing from the city?
I find it very inspiring. Obviously, it's a very literary city. There's lots of writers living in Edinburgh. The landscape or the Scottishness of it, coming from Switzerland, and really I've realised how different, even though we are kind of both in Europe, Switzerland and Scotland, maybe not for much longer, obviously, how different these countries are. And so my second novel, again, The Waiting, is, as I said earlier, is set in Scotland, whereas the other one, the first one, was set in Switzerland. But Edinburgh is, for me, like becomes a character, and a character over time, over history. Like in The Waiting, for example, there's an old woman who is portrayed through her childhood into her young adulthood, into her old age. And of course, Edinburgh, we have Jekyll and Hyde, which has this kind of supernatural aspect. And recently, well, in fact, for the last few years now, my writing has very much moved in this direction of the uncanny. I've always written uncanny stories and also my novels are slightly uncanny, I think, but not as much as the new stories. And I'm quite sure that atmosphere of you're never quite sure what's around the corner, and you might suddenly find you start off on a nice walk and wow, you end up somewhere totally different, and events take a sinister turn maybe, or just a different turn.
Fantastic. So what an interesting lot of influences there that you've been discussing. And I wanted to ask you, talking about all these different ideas that come to you, do you have lots of ideas for books or stories that don't get it written? So books that you might test out the ideas for a while and then decide you're going to set them to one side and not continue with? Or do you have a queue of ideas that you're quite methodical in working through? I know it can get really easy to be distracted with new ideas when you're in the middle of a novel in particular.
I have lots of ideas for work, and as I said before, often when I'm in the bathroom something pops into my mind. So I have all these little notelets and a pen, on top of the washing machine, and I would start writing out maybe a sentence or even 2 sentences until both sides of the notelets are covered. And I've ended up with a whole pile of these notelets. I take them up to my desk. My desk is littered. It's like a rainbow of these different coloured notelets with sometimes fading writing because the sun comes in through the skylight and fades my writing. So I don't know whether they will ever become something longer or not. But it's somehow almost a confidence thing. I know that I have this pile of ideas. And, if I sift through it, I'm dead sure that I could get a story or even a novel out of them. But the question is, will I ever get to the point? Usually I just get started somewhere. Might even close my eyes for a moment and just sit. But then I would try and get started and see how far I can go. I'm a very slow writer, very, very slow. You'd probably be shocked how slow. It takes several months over one short story. And that's partly to do with me not being a native speaker, and I feel less certain of my abilities and my skills. Partly probably also to do with my perfectionism when it comes to writing. I want to get things right, and the strange thing is once I get started, I seem to do the editing as I go along, and I have to force myself not to, to actually let it flow, because that's what I tell my students, whom I teach creative writing at the galleries, at National Gallery I used to, and now at the City Arts Centre, the Museum of Childhood. And I say to them, look, just let it flow. Don't stop yourself. Thinking is overrated. Get with it, and you get into this spirit almost, that guides your hand. If you use a pen, I myself just type. That's how I do it. I sometimes close my eyes even when I write and type like that. Well, it's very helpful, that. And then I go with that. Yeah, but I have abandoned, to come back to your original question. I seem to have digressed a bit here, sorry. Once I feel there is something there, even if it's just 2 paragraphs, I usually get a gut feeling and I know, yup, I want to go with this. There's something there. And then I won't abandon it. I've done a lot of stories recently. I've almost finished a new book of stories, my 3rd collection. For a novel, that's a slightly different matter, because I started a novel a few years back now, and I wrote quite a bit, and then somehow I got sidetracked and abandoned it. But it's a very odd thing. I have a real guilt complex about this novel, and it's like at the back of my mind all the time. I know I have to write this novel.
And you think you will go back to it?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yes. But I know it's set in Switzerland again, so it's a weird thing. I started with a book of stories, Inside Outside. Then I had my first novel, which was Swiss-based, The Beauty Room. Then I went back to stories and had Fighting It that came out, short stories, and then another novel, and that one set in Scotland, like The Waiting. And now it's another book of stories I'm finishing, and then I want to have another novel, and again in Switzerland. So it seems a very weird thing.
So you have a pattern perhaps that you're following.
But it's an unconscious pattern. You know, I'm not aware of doing it. To be honest, if I could get away with it, I would probably prefer writing stories, simply because it's like being in the middle of the sea and you can't see land on either side, and you're maybe just a bit unsure which way should you swim or which way should you go. Stories are much easier in that respect to finish, because at least they are shorter. So you can send them off, you get publication, and it gives you a bit of confidence. It's often a confidence thing, isn't it? And in the middle of a novel, you might feel a bit slack and a bit uncertain.
Well, that was actually one of my questions. So have you got any tried and tested means of getting out of those spots where it feels really difficult and tough? When writing's feeling tough, what do you do to keep going?
Well, I might take Layla, our retriever, for a walk and clear my mind. I might make myself a nice cappuccino, an espresso coffee, just to cheer myself up, because usually then it's a sort of a sense of feeling depressed a bit. Depression, I'm sure many writers feel that every so often. You just have to, I think there's a bit of having to force yourself as well and not give up. I think being a creative person, you feel that you have to really look deep into yourself and ask yourself, well, would I want to do something else? And if the answer is no, that's what I am, that's who I am, I'm a writer, that's what I do, then that can give you a certain bit of ground, solid ground. And you have to go from there and maybe write a story. I think that's the way out. If you're stuck in the middle of a novel, like I did, I started writing stories and I found that, that will get me onto a different track, and then I can come back to this novel that I know is almost fully formed somewhere inside me. I really feel that very strongly, but it's been sitting for a while.
And when you're balancing your day, do you write, for example, for a set number of hours or a set word count that you're trying to achieve? Or is it really that you're thinking about your writing all the time?
Yeah, in some ways I think about my writing all the time, feeling guilty, because as I said, I often procrastinate, I put it off. Because in some ways I find it a very painful thing to do.
And do you think when you're trying to ascertain that a project's finished, that's always quite tricky, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So with a short story or a novel, what would you say about that? How you know when it is ready to be submitted or it is on the final revision?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I write and rewrite as I go along a lot. Really a lot. I really can't emphasize this enough, how much I revise and edit and change, move things around. That's why I need a computer and can't handwrite, because my pages, everything would be scrolled over so badly that I couldn't read. And so really, but when I feel that I'm just fiddling with a text, that's usually a sign that I better leave it alone. When I actually end up, and I do that, I did it yesterday in fact, moving bits of the text first up a bit and then back down where it was originally, And the same with commas. You put in a comma one day and feel, right, yeah, wonderful, that's in the right place now. Next day you take it out, and then the day after you put it back in. I do this with commas, maybe with a word or with a phrase, and then that's it. Leave it alone. You're just making it worse otherwise. You're putting in.
So in a way, it's kind of maybe an addiction to the editing process.
Yes.
That keeps, because I understand that as well, editing myself. But
you just have to let go. But the other thing, I think, quite an important aspect is you have to leave your work to sit for a while and then go back to it. And if after a month, after 2 months, 3 months, it still looks good, and it sounds good, because I often read maybe sections of the text to myself, because there's a rhythm that I work sometimes almost like a poet, I think. That's why it takes so long, I'm sure. Anyway, but once you see it again, or you go back to a text after at least, I would say, a couple of weeks, and it still rings true, then that's it, I think. You can trust yourself.
And can you tell us a little bit about where you are with your current project and a bit about that project?
Right, that's the short story collection that I've almost finished, and currently I'm looking through the stories, and I'm thinking of doing another one. In fact, I've just started another one, a very short one that I might include. Mostly these stories, as I mentioned earlier, are to do with, I think, not quite the supernatural, but they're like speculative fiction. They are sort of like slipstream, all these genre descriptions. I'm never quite sure what they actually mean, but it's just, for me, to do with reality going slightly off kilter. And so it's no longer quite real. You don't quite know where you are. Slightly criminal almost. There's crime elements as well in these stories. So they're like crossing boundaries, transgressions almost within the stories themselves.
And I suppose in terms of knowing when it's finished, like you say, whether you're going to include another story or when you stop, that must be a bit of a...
Yeah. I have also wanted to make sure that all the stories get published. And I've almost reached this point where the vast majority of them have come out.
So you mean, so you're looking at publications in different magazines literary magazines, and then they all become the together as a collection?
That's right, yes. It gives some kind of kudos as well if you've had your work published previously in literary magazines.
And do you sometimes have them published in more than one magazine, or do you always stick with one?
Yes, like the story that was in Best British Short Stories, that came out originally in Ambit in London, literary magazine, then was published in Best British Short Stories. Then it was published twice online, once as a what do they call it, a weekend read for Book's Sake. That's a wonderful, wonderful literary website, and they only leave the story up for a week. And the good thing is then it's not just available online, because that can also pose problems if you then try and get a publisher, because you don't want all your work to be freely available, because then what would be the point in getting a publisher to bring out the book if anybody can just Google all the works that are in it, so.
And so it sounds like actually that is quite a challenge, and the amount of time it will take to get them all published and then again to find a publisher. And I suppose you have to have quite a lot of discipline for your submissions as well.
Right. Yeah, you actually put your finger on it, Claire, because it is very time consuming. Yeah, because you have to do the formatting right, you have to, all the requirements for different literary magazines, and you have to check the time frames, because some of them only look at work within maybe 1 month a year, 2 months a year, and you have to do your research so you know where to send your work as well.
And so do you feel that you're kind of always looking for opportunities?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I have just been asked to contribute a piece to a project in Switzerland, which will be, I think it's called Freedom Papers, and it's a Swiss. Well, she's actually American, but she lives in Switzerland, originally a singer, musician, composer, who wanted to include one of my pieces, which will then be sung, I don't know, with music or whatever. And the other project, I've been asked to contribute a piece for a translation project in Romania. And so I'm very pleased, so one of the stories will also be translated into Romanian.
So I was going to ask you about your advice for writers starting off. And I think, we've just covered something really useful, which was this always looking for opportunity, which I think is so important. And we often don't see that graft that writers are putting in. When we see them being successful, we don't realise how much effort has gone into that. So what would be your advice or top tips for writers just starting out?
I really suggest you read a lot, read widely. Read beyond your comfort zone, but also write a lot. because you might find you'll have to discard a lot. In fact, my computer is full of these files, with all these snippets in them, bits and pieces. Every story I write, there's usually a long, like a tailback of paragraphs that were rewritten in the process and I didn't have the heart to cut. So they are like stuck there at the end, like maybe as double as long as the story itself, but just do that, write, rewrite, write a lot.
Well, thank you so much for that. Before you go, I'd love you to tell us where readers can find out more about your work and keep in touch with you.
I've got a website, very simple to remember. It's www.regiclaire.com, and Regi is spelled R-E-G-I, Regi, and then Claire, C-L-A-I-R-E, regiclaire.com. Thank you very much for having me, Claire.